They called her the Cursed Girl of Ashford, and half the county came to St. Aldrich's church that morning, not to bless a marriage, but to watch a title be sold to a monster. None of them knew that before the candles burned low that night, the bridegroom would be the one on his knees, and the truth he uncovered would have nothing to do with fire and everything to do with murder. St. Aldrich's had never held so many people who despised the bride they came to see. Every pew was filled with silk and whispered cruelty, and not one soul among them had come to wish Eleanor Whitmore well. They had come to see the spectacle everyone in Ashford had been promised for weeks, the wedding of a ruined earl to the girl the town called cursed. Eleanor stood at the back of the church, 26 years old, her gloved hands folded tightly at her waist. Beneath the high lace collar of her gown, a burn scar spread from her collarbone up the left side of her throat, pale and rippled where fire had taken the skin 12 years before. Her left hand, hidden inside a long glove that never came off in public, bore the same marks, the fingers slightly curled from old damage that had never fully healed. She had heard every name Ashford had given her over the years. The burned bride, Whitmore's curse, the girl the fire didn't want. She walked toward the altar without lowering her eyes, because she had decided, quietly, on this one morning of her life, that she would not give them the satisfaction of watching her flinch. At the altar stood a man the newspapers had already begun to pity. Julian Hale, newly inherited Earl of Ravenswood, tall and composed, his expression carved into the calm of a man who had made peace with a decision before doubt could catch him. He did not flinch when she came into view. He did not smile falsely, and he did not look away. He simply watched her walk toward him the way a man watches a storm he has already decided to stand in. The whispers followed her up the aisle like smoke. He must have been paid a fortune to marry that. No amount of lace could hide what the fire left behind. Someone laughed behind a fan, thin and cruel. Julian heard every word. His face did not change. When Eleanor reached him, he stepped forward before the clergyman gave the signal and offered her his arm in front of everyone. A small thing, but the first act of loyalty either of them had received in that church that day. 3 weeks before the wedding, Julian Hale had stood in the ruin of his family's estate and tried to remember what it felt like to have choices. Ravenswood Hall had once been among the finest houses in the county. Now half its tenant farms were mortgaged past redemption, and the Hale name had been dragged through every paper in England, since his father was accused of defrauding the very bank that held the family's debts. The scandal had frozen their accounts and left Julian, at 32, responsible for a mother who no longer left her rooms, and a younger brother whose future had shrunk to nothing. He had learned quickly that a title without money was simply a beggar with a better coat. So when Edmund Whitmore's letter arrived requesting a private audience, Julian had gone, because pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Edmund received him in a study lined with ledgers and old portraits, a tall, silver-haired man whose voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime getting exactly what he wanted from other people. "I understand your family's difficulties," Edmund said without preamble. "I am prepared to resolve them entirely. My stepdaughter Eleanor requires a husband. In exchange for your name and a single ceremony, I will clear every debt against Ravenswood, restore your family's standing, and see your brother properly settled at university. All of it, Julian, for a wedding ring and a bit of patience with a girl London finds difficult to look at." Julian had heard the rumors about Eleanor Whitmore the way every man in the county had heard them. Cruel, exaggerated, repeated at dinner tables as entertainment. He asked to meet her before he answered, because whatever else he was not a man who would marry a stranger and flinch at her in public like a coward. Edmund arranged it grudgingly. Eleanor received him standing rather than seated, as if sitting might feel too much like an invitation to be studied. "You may look your fill, my lord," she said before he could speak. "I am told it is customary before purchase." "I am not here to purchase anything, Miss Whitmore." "No, only to marry it." Her voice was dry, entirely without self-pity. "My stepfather tells me you are desperate. I am told I am cursed. It seems a fair trade for both of us to pretend otherwise for the length of a ceremony." Julian found, unexpectedly, that he did not want to lie to her. "I will not pretend I am marrying you for affection. I would be a fool to insult you with that lie, but I will not insult you with false horror either. You are not what the town says you are. What am I then?" "Someone I have not yet had the chance to know." It was not romantic. It was not even especially kind. But it was honest, and Eleanor had received so little honesty in her life that it struck her harder than any compliment could have. She accepted the marriage for her own reasons, reasons she told no one, not even Julian. Her stepfather had promised that once she married, she would finally leave Whitmore House and take control of Hartwell Mill, the property her late mother had left her in trust. 12 years of being managed, watched, and quietly hidden away had taught Eleanor to want nothing so much as a door she could close behind herself and know it would not be locked from the outside. What she did not know, what neither of them yet understood, was the shape of the trap closing around them both. Eleanor's mother, Margaret Whitmore, had died 12 years before in a fire that consumed the east wing of Hartwell Mill, the very night Eleanor herself had been burned trying to reach her. The county had called it a tragic accident, a collapsed lamp, dry timber, terrible luck. Eleanor had never believed that explanation for a single day of her life. She remembered voices in the smoke that were not her mother's. She remembered being pulled away from a door that would not open, though she had never told anyone that detail, not even the physician who tended her burns for months afterward. Margaret had left behind a fortune entirely separate from the Whitmore estate, the mill itself, shares in the regional railway, and a modest trust that Edmund had managed as trustee throughout Eleanor's minority. Under the terms of that trust, Eleanor would gain full legal control of everything the moment she married, or on her 30th birthday, whichever came first. Edmund had spent 12 careful years drawing from that fortune to cover losses he could never admit to. Once Eleanor married, the theft would become impossible to hide. With his solicitor, a quiet man named Percival Grange, Edmund had built something far darker than a simple marriage of convenience. Enough money would flow to make the union look legitimate. And within months, an accident, another fire perhaps, or something quieter, would return Hartwell Mill to Whitmore hands, before anyone thought to ask questions. In the carriage after the ceremony, Eleanor sat with her spine perfectly straight, her gloved hands folded over her bouquet, long after there was any need to hold it. Julian, who had spent the whole ceremony reading every small hesitation in his new wife's posture, understood that something was deeply wrong, though he could not yet name it. "You need not perform composure for my benefit," he said quietly, using her new title for the first time. "I have already seen you as you are. There is no audience left to convince." "There is always an audience," Eleanor said, "even when it is only you." He did not press her further. He had learned enough in one short conversation weeks before to understand that pressing Eleanor only closed doors that patience might eventually open. Neither of them yet knew that by the time the candles at Ravenswood Hall burned down that night, the true horror of this marriage would have nothing to do with the scars society had mocked her for, and everything to do with what her stepfather had truly done to her mother 12 years before, in a fire the world had long since forgotten to question. At Ravenswood Hall, the staff had prepared the traditional wedding night arrangements. A lady's maid to assist the new countess, warmed water, a fire built high against the evening chill. Eleanor dismissed the maid at the bedchamber door with a firmness that startled the girl. "I will manage alone," she said. Julian, standing in the corridor outside, heard the maid's soft protest and Eleanor's sharper refusal, and something in his chest tightened that he could not yet explain. He waited nearly an hour before he knocked, giving her the privacy she seemed so desperate to have. "Eleanor, I only wish to know if you require anything. I'm not asking to enter uninvited." Silence stretched long enough that he nearly knocked again. Then her voice came, quieter than he had yet heard it. "You may come in if you wish." What Julian saw when he stepped into that room would remain with him for the rest of his life. Eleanor stood near the fire, her wedding gown loosened at the back, where she had struggled to unlace it herself, her long glove finally removed and set aside on the dressing table. The burn scars ran further than her throat had shown. Across her shoulder, down the length of her left arm, the skin rippled and tight in places, pale in others, the marks of a fire that had taken far more than the newspapers ever printed. "You may look," she said, her chin lifted from long habit. "I find I no longer have the strength to hide it from you specifically. There is little point." But he crossed the room slowly and did not loom over her, bringing himself instead to sit in the chair beside the fire, eye level with where she stood. "May I ask what happened?" "A fire 12 years ago, at Hartwell Mill, the night my mother died." Her voice was steady, though her free hand moved instinctively toward her scarred wrist. Everyone believes it was an accident. A lamp, dry wood, bad luck. I was 11. I remember voices in the smoke that were not my mother's, and a door that would not open no matter how I pulled at it. No one has ever believed me when I say it did not feel like an accident. Not the physician, not my stepfather, not the coroner. So I stopped saying it. Julian thought of his own father, disgraced and ruined by a scandal that had never been properly investigated, and something cold settled in his chest. I believe you, he said simply. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, searching as she always did for the flicker of pity or performance that would tell her this was theater. She found instead something steadier, a man sitting quietly by a fire, asking permission for every small thing, refusing to take from her the only power she had left, which was the power to decide what she shared and when. Sit with me a moment, she said finally. There is something I want to show you, though I have never shown it to anyone. She retrieved a small wooden box from beneath her dressing table, worn at the corners, and from it drew a stack of papers, not letters, but sketches. Dozens of them, drawn over years in careful, obsessive detail. Julian realized as she laid them out by candlelight that they were all the same room, drawn again and again from every possible angle. A study with a writing desk, tall windows, a fireplace drawn from memory with the precision of someone who had spent 12 years refusing to let a single detail fade. I could not speak of that night without people deciding I was hysterical, Eleanor said quietly, arranging the pages by the fire's light. So I drew it instead, every year from memory to see if anything new surfaced. 2 years ago, this did. She pulled one sketch forward, the study, but with a second smaller doorway drawn faintly behind the writing desk, one that did not appear in any of the earlier drawings. There was a passage behind that desk. I did not remember it until I was old enough to understand what I was looking at. My mother's study had a hidden door, and on the night of the fire I heard it close before the smoke ever reached me. Julian stared at the sketch, then at her, genuinely speechless for the first time since the ceremony that morning. Not from the horror of the story, but from the sheer, quiet determination it represented. A woman who had spent 12 years alone, methodically working toward a truth no one else believed existed, using nothing but memory and candlelight, and a steadiness of hand the world had never once given her credit for. You believe someone was in that room with your mother? He said slowly. Someone who left through a passage no one else knew about. I believe my stepfather has spent 12 years making very sure that no one ever asks that question. Eleanor met his eyes without flinching. And I believe that now that I am married, and Hartwell Mill's trust passes into my control by law, he has run out of time to keep it quiet. The following weeks built a fragile domestic peace between them, born less from romance than from shared purpose. They took to reviewing Eleanor's mother's old estate papers together in the evenings, and Julian discovered, to his genuine admiration, that Eleanor understood the mill's finances and old land contracts better than any solicitor he had employed. She had taught herself everything, she admitted. In the long hours her stepfather believed she was resting. There were smaller moments, too. Julian noticed the chair Eleanor avoided in the drawing room, a delicate gilded thing with thin arms that pressed uncomfortably against her scarred wrist, and without comment, replaced it with a sturdier one, simply there the next time she needed to sit. When a visiting dressmaker began speaking about Eleanor's arm as though she were not in the room, suggesting long sleeves to disguise the scarring, Julian dismissed the woman before Eleanor had to say a word. She was furious at being handled rather than asked, and he apologized without excuse, letting her choose her own seamstress after a quiet local woman who fitted gowns to the arm Eleanor actually had, rather than the one the world wished she possessed. It was into this careful, unfinished piece that the first real danger arrived. Eleanor's lady's maid, a sharp young woman named Nora, had taken to tasting her mistress's evening tea before serving it. An old habit born of instinct rather than specific fear. One evening she drank from a cup meant for Eleanor, and collapsed within the hour, her breathing shallow, her skin cold. Julian did not wait for the household physician, a man with old ties to Whitmore House. He rode himself through the night to fetch an independent doctor from the next town. Nora survived, though it took 2 days before the fever broke. Eleanor sat beside the girl's bed through both of those days, her hands never still. "It was meant for me," she said quietly on the second night, and when Julian brought her tea she did not touch. "Someone in this house is still reporting to my stepfather. Ravenswood was never a refuge. It was only ever another version of the house I grew up in." "Then we stopped waiting for your stepfather's permission to be safe," Julian said, and something in his voice had changed entirely from the calm courtesy of their wedding day. "We stop waiting, and we begin proving what you have always known." That night, with Nora finally sleeping and the house quiet around them, Eleanor led Julian to the small locked study at Ravenswood that had belonged to his own late father. The one room in the house that still held boxes of old correspondence no one had touched since the scandal that ruined the Hale name. Because if her stepfather had spent years silencing a truth about a fire, Eleanor reasoned, there was a chance the man who had helped bury it had left some trace of his own guilt behind, in the one place no one had thought to look. What they found inside would take them from a hidden passage behind a dead woman's writing desk all the way to a conspiracy that had already claimed one life and very nearly claimed a second, 12 years before anyone thought to ask the right question. The correspondence in Julian's father's old study took 3 nights to fully understand. Hidden inside innocent-looking business letters between the elder Hale and a man named Percival Grange, the very solicitor who now served Edmund Whitmore. Julian's father, it turned out, had once discovered irregularities in the Whitmore trust accounts years before his own scandal broke, and had written to Grange demanding an explanation. The replies grew steadily more threatening. Within months, an anonymous accusation of fraud had destroyed the Hale family's reputation entirely, and the elder Hale had died believing himself simply unlucky. "My father was silenced," Julian said, his voice flat with fury he was struggling to contain, "because he asked the same question you have been asking for 12 years. Eleanor did not misread his anger this time. She took his hand instead. "Then we are not uncovering 2 separate wrongs, Julian. We are uncovering one." Working late into successive nights, they traced the pattern together. Edmund Whitmore had been drawing from Eleanor's mother's trust for over a decade before the fire, funding failed investments he could never openly explain. Margaret Whitmore had discovered the theft roughly a year before her death, and had begun quietly gathering evidence of her own. Evidence that, if made public, would have stripped Edmund of both his fortune and his freedom. The passage Eleanor remembered behind her mother's writing desk led to a servants' corridor that connected directly to Edmund's own study. On the night of the fire, Margaret had confronted him with what she'd found. The fire that followed had not been an accident at all. Confirmation came from an unexpected source. Nora, recovering slowly, revealed that her own aunt had once worked as the upstairs maid at Hartwell Mill, and had been dismissed suddenly, without reference, the week after the fire. Paid an unusually generous sum to leave the county quietly, and never discuss what she had seen that night. Julian found the woman within days, now elderly and living modestly 2 counties away, and she agreed at last to give a written account of what she had witnessed. Edmund Whitmore leaving the burning east wing through the servants' passage, alone, calm without a single burn upon him, while his wife and stepdaughter remained trapped inside. Sensing the ground shifting beneath him, Edmund did not wait to see how far the investigation would reach. He arranged for a private threat to be delivered to Julian directly. Full restoration of Ravenswood's finances, complete clearing of the Hale name in the papers, and a quiet annulment to end the marriage without scandal in exchange for the return of every document Eleanor had gathered, and her quiet removal to a private residence in the country, away from anyone who might listen to her. Julian refused the offer in writing, before witnesses, though it cost him the one bargain that had first brought him to the altar. Eleanor would not learn of that refusal until much later, and when she did, it would mean more to her than any declaration spoken aloud. The formal inquiry convened at the county magistrate's hall on a gray autumn morning, attended by solicitors, trustees, and members of both the Whitmore and Hale families, called ostensibly to settle a dispute over the mill's trust, but understood by everyone present to be something far larger. Edmund had expected a quiet, private settlement among gentlemen. He had not expected his stepdaughter to arrive on her husband's arm, sleeves rolled back to the elbow, her scars fully visible for the first time in 12 years without a single attempt to hide what the fire had left behind. Whispers moved through the hall the moment she entered, the same whispers that had followed her up the aisle at St. Aldrich's. This time Eleanor did not lower her eyes. She presented the sketches first, 12 years of patient, obsessive memory laid out with the same careful precision she had once used to correct her mother's old estate ledgers. She presented the maid's written testimony. She presented the threatening correspondence between Edmund's solicitor and Julian's late father, proof that the Hale family's ruin had been engineered to silence a witness to years of theft. She presented the bank records showing systematic withdrawals from her own trust that Edmund had never been able to explain. Edmund, cornered at last by evidence he could no longer discredit, lost the composure that had served him his entire life. "Had Margaret simply signed the papers I asked of her," he said, his voice rising for the first time anyone in that hall had ever heard it rise, "none of this would have been necessary." The room went silent at the admission buried inside his own fury. Pressed further by the magistrate, Edmund revealed, in a moment of broken pride he would spend the rest of his life regretting, that he had started the fire deliberately to destroy Margaret's evidence, never intending for either his wife or stepdaughter to be trapped inside. A claim no one in that hall fully believed, least of all Eleanor. Julian did not speak over his wife throughout the proceeding. He intervened only once, submitting his own written refusal of Edmund's final bargain as evidence, proof that he had given up an entire fortune rather than betray the woman standing beside him. "My wife," he told the inquiry when at last he was asked to speak, "and my equal in every part of this matter." The magistrates ordered Edmund Whitmore held for trial on charges of fraud and arson, charges that would end in the months that followed with his conviction and the loss of everything he had spent 12 years protecting. Percival Grange faced his own prosecution for forgery and conspiracy. The elder Hale's name was formally cleared, though the inquiry acknowledged that the scandal had cost the family years they could never fully recover. Eleanor received full legal control of Hartwell Mill and her mother's entire fortune. Ravenswood Hall was restored not through Edmund's broken promises, but through the plain judgment of the law, earned rather than purchased. In the quiet that followed, Julian told Eleanor plainly that the circumstances of their marriage had been coercive from the beginning, and that he would understand if she wished an annulment now that she was free to choose anything at all. "Do you want your freedom?" Eleanor asked him. "No," Julian said, "but your choice must matter more than what I want. It always should have." Eleanor chose him. They exchanged new vows privately at Hartwell Mill the following spring, in the very study where the hidden passage had once been sealed permanently shut, with no stepfather presiding, no county watching, and no fortune changing hands to explain why either of them had stayed. Society did not become suddenly kind in the months that followed. Some still stared when Eleanor entered a room, with her sleeves rolled back, her scars visible and unapologetic. The difference now was that she no longer treated their stares as a verdict on her worth. She had spent a lifetime being told her body told a story of misfortune. She had finally proven it told a story of survival instead. And she no longer needed anyone's permission to know it. If Eleanor and Julian's story moved something in you tonight, then you already understand why we tell these tales. If you enjoyed this journey through fire, silence, and a truth finally spoken aloud after 12 long years, please like this video, subscribe if you have not already, and tell us in the comments which moment struck you hardest. The sketches by candlelight, the hidden passage, or the vows spoken with no father watching. We have another bride, another secret, and another woman the world underestimated waiting for you very soon. Thank you for spending this hour with us, and we will see you at the next fireside.